My friends, good day. I'm not so unrealistic as to believe that we will ever know the complete truth about Korean Airlines Flight 902. I'm going to tell you what we know, or maybe what we think we know. Everyone will make up their own mind. It's April 20, 1978 at Orly Airport. There's a Boeing 707 about to depart for Seoul, South Korea. There are 109 people on board, and the flight crew are military personnel, as was often the case with this airline at that time. Heroes of the Korean War, right? And then the plane takes off with its actual destination being Alaska. Why Alaska? Simply because it needs to make a technical stop, so it takes off and heads north. It will follow a Great Circle route, an orthodromic path, which will take it over the United Kingdom, Scotland. It will pass north of Iceland, and it will cross Greenland while continuing north. And at some point, when it's practically over Canadian territory, it's very close, just a short distance away, as they say, from the geographic North Pole. And normally at this stage, it is supposed to start curving its trajectory more and more towards, quote unquote, towards the south to head to its first technical stop. The problem is that at this stage, this plane makes an inexplicable maneuver that will remain a mystery. It will turn to the right. It turns right. How? It's not making a full 180-degree turn to go back the way it came, but almost. It will make a turn of nearly 160 degrees. It's night, a beautiful starry night, and there's the moon. The people who saw the moon from one window will start to see it from the other. The plane turns back and is heading off again. Where is it heading? It's heading toward the territory of the USSR. In reality, it's heading toward Russia. At that time, there were no diplomatic relations between the USSR and South Korea. Korean planes avoided the territory of the Soviet republics. The pilots are in their cockpit. Everything seems to be going normally, and they don't realize that they've turned around, which is very, very hard to believe. In any case, for several hours, our plane, which was almost in Canada, starts heading back toward Europe this time. It goes back to Russia and then keeps flying calmly at 9,500 meters. The Soviet Air Force is going to realize that, there's a plane that hasn't checked in on the radio frequency. It hasn't talked to anyone. There's no flight plan. There's nothing at all. It's flying kind of randomly, and it's entering their territory. They monitor it before it reaches the border. Then after a while, it crosses the borders and goes deep into Russian territory. Of course, several Su-15s will take off from multiple bases in the region to intercept it. They position themselves at its sides. And then the passengers are making gestures to the pilots through the window, taking pictures, all that. So it's a little strange because at this stage of their journey, they should already be in the temperate zones if we're talking about Canada, right? They shouldn't be very far. We're heading towards Vancouver normally at this stage. And then the guys, they see some Su-15s with the red star from the Soviet Union. So there's a bit of an anomaly. The pilots continue for several minutes. And then they decide to turn back. So they're going to turn back once again. And then they get back on course. The problem is that for aviation, for the Soviet Air Force generals who were woken up in the middle of the night, there's a big problem. That means, what are we going to do about it? Because if we just let it go like that, heads will roll. The political commissar, the army officials, all of them will demand explanations, will demand that people be demoted, sent to prison, all of that. And they start arguing over the radio. They start arguing. They're threatening pilots with court-martial. There are obscenities, the kind people say over the radio for everyone to hear. And so the stress is going to rise. The pilots are getting conflicting orders. They hear people yelling at them. And at one point, while our plane is 6 minutes from the border, from reaching the border with Finland, so that means in 6 minutes it was going to leave Soviet territory and exit their jurisdiction. He decides there's a pilot who receives the order to shoot it down. So he's going to shoot at it. He's going to fire a missile at it, a missile air to air. The missile is launched. It uses infrared guidance. It locks onto the heat emitted by the engines. The Boeing 707 has 4 engines. You'd think it had 4 engines. There aren't many flying today. It's going to chase that plane and then it's going to explode. Big explosion. And so what was supposed to happen happened. Actually, no, not really. What was supposed to happen didn't happen. I don't know what happened with that missile. There was a miracle that day. Maybe it got damp. Maybe it was stored wrong. Maybe it was defective. Maybe it was past its expiration date. It doesn't matter. Something happened with that missile that made it extremely ineffective. It exploded. It exploded. It tore off 3 meters of wing. On the left side of the plane, 3 meters of wing are gone. They've been torn off. It's a miracle. There's no ruptured fuel tank, nothing caught fire, none of that. In that case, the plane would have crashed like a comet. What happened instead is that fragments from the missile hit the fuselage and pierced it. There are 2 passengers who are injured. One of them was killed instantly. One of them is injured by shrapnel. We're in rows 23 and 24. And then the first one will die right away and the other one a little later. 2 Koreans were killed. Afterwards, the pilots realized that they're going to have more and more trouble controlling the plane. What do they decide to do? They decide, well, to dive toward the ground, especially since there's a depressurization, so the masks drop and all that. So they decide to descend, that their only option is to go toward the ground to begin with. So they head toward the ground. A Russian plane launches a second missile. The second missile is fired and hits what? It miraculously hits the 3 meters of wing that were torn off. That means we have another plane that's going down. There's the piece of wing that's falling too, and the missile, instead of hitting and finishing off the plane, it's going to hit the piece of wing and shred it. The aircraft flies just above the ground, engines intact and some control remaining. The pilots tell themselves they have to land because they don't know how long they'll be able to fly with a plane that's so badly damaged. Then what do? They try to lower the landing gear. It comes out halfway and gets stuck. And then they're flying over forests, a very dense forest. Landing in the forest might not be the best idea. They don't know. These trees look very tall, very solid. They could tear the plane apart and then kill everyone. So they keep flying for a few seconds just above the forest in the night. And suddenly they see an area ahead that isn't covered with trees. They see a clearing somewhere. All right, a place that suddenly with the moon looks bright, clear. And then they say to themselves, let's try. It was a frozen lake, actually. It was a lake that had frozen. And it was still in the month of April. They set it down gently on that ice there. The landing gear tears through the ice. In some images, you can see the marks left by the landing gear. You can recognize the 2 main landing gears. The nose gear is apparently not deployed, so you can see the damage that was done, the marks left in the ice by the landing gear. And then the plane will slide. It will keep sliding on its own until it reaches an island with some trees still there, and it stops there. It's one of the most extraordinary landings ever made with a commercial airliner of that size. It's something you see once in a century. The Boeing 707 is a pretty crazy plane, and there's even a test pilot who performed a complete barrel roll with it. And here we have a pilot who landed it out in the middle of nowhere on ice, and he even slid until he reached solid ground. The plane stops there. The fighter pilots in flight are looking for the plane. They don't know what happened to it. They're looking for it, they're circling, and obviously they've lost it. Once the plane comes to a stop, the passengers open the doors and then they go out onto the ice, into the snow. The problem is they were dressed, they had left from Paris, they were dressed in spring clothes, light shirts, t-shirts, things like that, and they find themselves in an extremely cold place. They will stay there for several hours until the local authorities send trucks, send the police, the army, all that, and take care of them. They're going to load them into trucks and take them to gymnasiums and similar places. So they were very bothered because these are areas that foreigners weren't supposed to visit because there was, let's say, some economic hardship in those areas. So we didn't want foreigners to see that, because in general, foreigners were confined to big cities and sometimes even to well-marked routes, so they would only see what we wanted to show them. They weren't meant to appear so unexpectedly this time. They were put in a gymnasium, metal beds, they started boiling rice. A doctor is brought to them, the 2 passengers who died. There's nothing more that can be done for them, but the others are in good health. A few days later, they go to question the pilots. They bring the captain before a commission. He arrives there with his uniform, his 4 stripes, takes out a box of Marlboro. Well, he offers them, but they don't want to smoke. He just wants to break the ice, or as we say, well, he takes out this pack from the decadent West, right? So that's why, since there were political inspectors there, well, no one dared to take one, even though they were all smokers. And then he answers their questions. So he explains he arrived near the South Pole, right? And then finally near the North Pole. And at one point, the system had a problem because the autopilot is fed by the navigation system. And then suddenly there was an error, and then it set off again. It headed south again. Knowing that when you're at the North Pole, in every direction, it's south. South is everywhere. Take that explanation for what it's worth, but it doesn't really hold up. All the more so because in those areas, he was probably navigating with the inertial system, which doesn't really care about the Earth's magnetic field. So it doesn't make sense. Besides, there are several IRS systems in the plane, and on top of that, there are pilots with maps. Back then, they even did celestial navigation and all that. How do you explain that for hours he went back toward Russia without realizing it? What would have happened if he hadn't been intercepted? He could have ended up in Turkey. At some point, he could have ended up in the middle of the Black Sea and said, we're in Russia, we messed up. That makes absolutely no sense. Even so, even if you look closely, back then, Korean planes had this tendency to get lost, had this tendency to mess up their navigation. About 5 years later, there was Korean Airlines 007, which had entered Russia from the other side. That one also messed up its navigation. And then it ended up being shot down. But you can see the repetition. You can see 5 years earlier, the same scenario being repeated. But next time, there will be a lot more victims. In any case, the Russians are going to look inside the plane. What will they find? They'll find a gun. They'll find a radio. And they'll find a Newsweek magazine. That would be enough to declare that it was probably an operation, a spy operation. Well, later on, we'll explain that yes, Newsweek is an American magazine, but it's distributed pretty much everywhere on airplanes. So there's nothing unusual about that. It was picked up by a pilot or a passenger a few days earlier. Guns weren't unusual. It was a time, it was the era of major airplane hijackings. So, well, why not? The pilots had a gun. As for the radio, well, there are several in a plane. It's normal to have a radio in a plane. There's nothing unusual about it. In any case, a few days later, what happened is that the passengers were taken by bus to another destination. There, they met the American ambassador because the United States had relations with the USSR. So they brought back a Pan Am 747 plane. All the passengers were released and they left. The crew stayed for another week. Answering more questions. And then, after a while, it became clear there was nothing more to get out of it. They were also put on a plane and went back home. The Boeing 707, it stayed on the snow for a while. Later, it was dismantled. There are very, very few images of it being dismantled. There's only one photo I was able to find, a black and white photo, where you can see it. You can see that the tail has fallen off. It seems that the local residents took some seats. The padded seats from the Boeing 707 made people happy. Apparently, they were found in the offices of the military. They were found in a bus. There's a bus driver who, it seems, installed rows of Boeing seats in his coach. There are also people from the area who took some seats. And then that's it. The story ended there. It was a very serious incident, a passenger plane that was shot down by a missile. And then, well, still there were 2 deaths and quite a lot of material damage. And that will foreshadow. It will be like something that signals that something more serious is going to happen, which will happen 5 years later with Korean Airlines 007, which was shot down, causing many victims this time. If you're looking for 007 look on the channel, there is a video that explains it in detail, and also the geostrategic context around it, because you can't separate one from the other. Thank you very much for watching this video up to this point. Thanks to Patreon supporters. Without them, this channel wouldn't exist. I'll see you in the next video. See you soon.